Hey guys, Hat Tricks with Travis. And in this trick, we're going to talk about building a new integration. While we do have an extensive library of integrations, there are applications that we just haven't gotten to, or maybe you have a homegrown application that just needs to reach the people. Fortunately, it's never been easier to get up and running with a brand new integration using Flow Designer and HTTP triggers. Let's go check it out. Okay, so here I have a blank canvas ready for my masterpiece, or at least a functional workflow of some kind. I have a request from the cats to build a new integration to alert when the auto cat food dispenser is malfunctioning. Of course, it's Wi-Fi enabled and has the ability to fire a webhook if it encounters an error. So naturally, we want to hook it up to xMatters. xMatters listens for webhooks using HTTP triggers. These triggers generate a URL to be fired to, parse the payload, and then send the outputs downstream. As a quick way to get started, we can create the trigger without any downstream steps. This will let us see the incoming payload and then guide us in parsing our script. As a quick way to get started, we can create the trigger without any downstream steps. This lets us see the incoming payload, which will guide us in writing our parsing script. So let's create a new trigger. For now, we'll just set some bare details such as the name and authentication method. Triggers support a variety of authentication methods with various levels of security, some of which may not be supported by the source application. For now, we'll use the URL auth, which appends the API key to the end of the URL, and this API key is tied to the user that we designate when we drop the trigger onto the canvas. The documentation on the error codes from the autofeeder is rather lacking. So we use the activity stream to inspect what it sends over and skip the outputs and script tabs for the moment. Cool. Now we drag the trigger onto the canvas. Then double-click the new step and copy the URL. Notice there's an API key value appended to the end, which serves as our authentication key. One sec, and I'll enter this into the autofeeder. Okay, I'm back. With the trigger on the canvas, let's check out the activity stream. Since I only have one flow, we only see one entry. The green switch enables and disables the logging and automatically turns itself off after 25 entries. This is nice for when you need to ensure you're not storing sensitive information, but can really trip things up when you are debugging or coding. So make sure that this switch is enabled. One other thing to verify is that the workflow itself is enabled. So let's just head back to the workflows and make sure that we are good to go there. Glad we checked that. If this is not enabled, the API call to the HTTP trigger will fail with a 404. So if you see the 404, the first thing to check is that the flow is enabled. Okay, let me go break the autofeeder so it triggers an error. There, after a good swift kick, the autofeeder triggered an error and fired the webhook we see in this entry here in the activity stream. All of the details of the incoming request are nicely laid out here. The Inputs tab shows the different parts of the incoming request object, but has the more complex parts broken out in their own tabs. So I can see the query parameters tacked onto the end of the URL, the headers, and of course the payload, or the body. Using this information, I can write my script. I just need to take into account what pieces of information I will need from this request. Some things to keep in mind: you will want to keep anything you want displayed to the users in the notification. Also, anything that might be useful for users to subscribe to, things like microservice or application name. And finally, anything you want to use in logic in the flow, such as the status of firing or recovered. Using this information, we can write the parsing script and quickly get integrating. Once I've decided what is important, I can reopen the trigger and add the outputs. Of course, this will depend on your individual payload, but I'll add a couple of outputs here: summary, message, message-type, and location. Then we'll head over and write the script. The incoming request object is stored as a JavaScript variable appropriately called request. From there, I can just use dot notation to access the different values we saw back in the activity stream. So request.parameters, request.headers, and request.body in particular. Since I noticed my payload came in as JSON, I'll use a json.parse to turn the request.body string value into a JavaScript object called payload. This line allows me to then access anything within payload using the same dot notation. So I pull out these values and populate the outputs I defined in the previous tab. Speaking of which, in case I forgot exactly what casing or spelling I used, I can expand the outputs on this left menu to verify. The outputs are populated into a variable called output, which is also a JavaScript object. But this menu is showing the elements of the output object using the JavaScript bracket notation instead of dot notation. For the most part, these notations are interchangeable, with the one major exception when the element name contains an unfriendly character that would violate the JavaScript syntax. My message-type output would violate that syntax, so I'm forced to use the bracket notation instead of the dot notation. But otherwise, they do the same thing. Typically, webhooks send all the details into the request body, but occasionally there will be useful information stored in the parameters as well. It just depends on the source application. Let me go kick the autofeeder again, and we'll inspect how our HTTP trigger maps the incoming values into usable outputs. I've refreshed my activity stream, and I see a new entry. With my updated trigger, I have a new tab for outputs, and I can see the script successfully mapped the values into the corresponding outputs. I can then use these outputs in any downstream step. That's all for today. I hope this was helpful. Stay tuned for more hat tricks with Travis.